Dr. Fauci is hopeful that Omicron's going to calm down. I would hope. I could predict accurately, but no one can. But I would hope by the time we get to the fourth week in January, end of the third week, this would be the third week, Dr. Fauci, beginning of the fourth week, that we'll start to see this coming down. Stephen Colbert said, can you be more specific? That's like your horoscope reading. Capricorn, you will make a connection with a handsome stranger or not. Maybe he'll give you disease. No one can predict accurately. Some people have been drinking urine as a cure. I'm not a medical doctor, but that seems a little whack job to me. Jimmy Kimmel said, I think Pfizer needs to come out with some gummies and a hard lemonade. Urine therapy is being promoted by a guy named Christopher Key. Kimmel said, if that guy's kids ever set up a lemonade stand in your neighborhood, run. Urine therapy? That's actually one conspiracy theory I'm okay with. If you think vaccines were created by the devil or George Soros or Bill Gates, go ahead, be in a mason jar and chug along with Dr. Dumbass. It's a very medical daily comedy news today from Variety. More than 260 doctors, nurses, scientists, health professionals, and academics in an open letter to Spotify have asked Spotify to implement a misinformation policy, specifically citing the Joe Rogan Experience and its concerning history of broadcasting misinformation, particularly regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. The letter highlighted Joe Rogan's New Year's Eve episode in which he hosted scientist Robert Malone. The letter says, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Joe Rogan has repeatedly spread misleading and false claims on his podcast. I kind of want to do this as Angry Jerry Seinfeld. I know it's a serious topic, but always go with the bit, right? Half-ass Angry Jerry Seinfeld. Can you come in here and read this letter for me, please? Thank you. While this COVID-19 pandemic, Joe Rogan has repeatedly spread misleading and false claims on his podcast, provoking distrust in science and medicine. He's discouraged vaccination of young people and children, incorrectly claimed that mRNA vaccines are gene therapy, promoted off-label use of ivermectin to treat COVID-19, contrary to FDA warnings. And spread a number of substantiated conspiracy theories. This is not only a scientific or medical concern, it's a sociological issue of devastating proportions, and Spotify is responsible for allowing this activity to thrive on its platform. Dr. Malone had used the Joe Rogan Experience platform to promote numerous baseless claims, writes Variety, including several falsehoods about COVID-19 vaccines and an unfounded theory that societal leaders have hypnotized the public. Here at Daily Comedy News, I encourage you, please get vaccinated. CNN caught up with Jim Gaffigan. Jim and family spent the spring of 2020 and the early months of the pandemic in New York City, but June found it to be overwhelming, so they moved upstate and bought a house. Jim talked about life 2 years into the pandemic and said, it's a lifetime, right? It's like describing the fall of Saigon, you know? There's so many emotions. I think it's going to be really interesting to see culturally how we all grow to understand what we went through. You know what I mean? Like, we know there's psychological effects. We know that it's probably been harder on kids. I feel like it's a little bit like watching an episode of Dateline. Like, you think you're going to find out information, then it gets to that 4-minute commercial chunk, and then there's a new variant when we get back. Jim didn't really write stand-up during the first year and a half of the pandemic. I was trying to exercise. I finally gained all my weight back. It took at least a week. You know, we're a household of 7, so it was like a round robin of people losing their mind. I remember that spring break, we as a family watched a movie every night, but the screens did take over, you know what I mean? Like, I'd be lying if I said they didn't. But the big thing we focused on was not killing each other. He talked about doing drive-in shows and said, it honestly felt really bad. You know, it was not the connection. That was a reflection of how desperate we were for a sense of community. At that point, I'd done stand-up for 30 years. I'd kind of established myself. I felt more for the people that were finally getting some traction, that were selling out shows. The Boston Globe talked to Demitri Martin. Demitri was in the car with his family when his son, who was then 5 years old, announced he had a joke to tell. Demitri said it was one of his proudest moments. He recognized that his son's joke was similar to a classic one-liner written by Steven Wright. Steven Wright openly a massive influence on Demitri Martin. Demitri said, he totally surprised me. I didn't have the vocabulary back then, but I thought, wow, this stuff is so economical. No segues. I like that I didn't know anything about him, didn't know anything about his life. I like that it was just about his perspective. Years later, they met backstage on Conan's show. He told Steven Wright what an influence he'd been. Gotta give credit where credit's due. Cedric the Entertainer was on Clubhouse. He was asked how the original Kings of Comedy were formed. He said, that was a product of timing. Of course, me and Steve Harvey were on the Steve Harvey show, so we were all together all the time, and this guy was promoting. He would do all of us individually. At that time, nobody thought about doing a big arena-style show, so comedy was really in the space because Def Comedy Jam was hot, and doing theater shows was the idea, so he'd promote us individually. He would do me and D.L. Hughley. He'd do Steve by himself. He'd do Bernie Mac by himself. Then I guess he had this idea to have this big show. He presented it to us like, yo, I want to take everybody out and I want to do arenas. We were all cool and we were able to work it out, and then we had D.L. Hughley. The first year was Bernie Mac, Steve, and Guy Torrey was our MC and opening act. The next year we had D.L. Hughley and Steve took over the MC spot. The Washington Post did a big profile of Greg Gutfeld, who I'm definitely going to misspeak and say Gutfield during this segment here. You know Gutfeld, he does the late night show on Fox. Washington Post writes, in Gutfeld's America, President Biden is a doddering geezer. The mainstream media is essentially a house organ for the left, and the nation isn't engaged in a necessary national conversation on race and racial disparities in housing, healthcare, and employment. Instead, Gutfeld aims to persuade his audience that the nation is consumed by destructive and divisive reverse racism. Gutfeld says, I have a lot more in common with liberals in terms of creativity, music, and all that stuff. Republicans are always seen as staid and stodgy. Gutfeld is a punk rock and metal fan who was delighted that he got splashed with blood not too long ago at a metal show. Now get this, Gutfeld, a self-described libertarian, says he doesn't remember how he's registered. Yeah? The Washington Post says he's officially listed as no party or refuses to disclose. The Washington Post writes, Gutfeld did not cast a ballot in the 2016 presidential election according to New York voting records reviewed by the Post. This came as a surprise to Gutfeld, who said he voted by mail, though he thinks it's possible he missed the deadline. Gutfeld, who's been critical of mail-in balloting, says he wrote in the name of someone with whom he works, but he can't remember who. The silliness. He loves poop and flatulence jokes and salts the program with low production skits and Trumpian name-calling is folded into surefire right-wing pleasers such as criticism of coronavirus vaccine mandates and mask requirements. Gutfeld is vaccinated. The Washington Post writes, therein lies the puzzle that is Greg Gutfeld. Is he merely the fool, or is he something larger? Gutfeld says in the theater, the fool often gets the best line. Continuing our medical theme, from thestar.com, since the beginning of the year, doctors in Bristol, England, have been able to prescribe a comedy course for their trauma patients. Sure, why not? Is laughter really the best medicine? To find out, the NHS, which is Britain's public health system, is running a trial that started New Year's Day in the city of Bristol. The program allows doctors to prescribe a comedy course to patients suffering from trauma. The aim is to help these people see the funny side of their experience. People suffering from conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, or grief are eligible for this trial. The program includes 6 weeks of writing workshops to pen lighthearted texts about patients' experiences during the sessions, which are free of charge. Participants are invited to act out the scenes. One of the doctors says it will allow us to release hormones, namely endorphins. It also activates the reward circuit with dopamine. Did you know as you age, your daily duration of laughter decreases, going from 300 bursts of laughter in children to just 20 in adults? That's your comedy news for today. Follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your shows. See you tomorrow.